There was once a world in which the idea of a triumvirate of forces was supreme. The belief that a combination of three powers ran everything, from the most simple and mundane to the most complex and cosmic, and of absolutely primary significance regarding consciousness. As they saw it, neither a single thought nor a thought supported by a single energy was possible, and likewise for any succeeding second, third, and so on thoughts. A few among them even claimed that a proper recognition of the situation would free one from the situation, assuming that you wanted to be. While a dozen eggs is made up of 12 eggs, there's no law that says they must be arranged in order numerically, 1 through 12. And there's also no law that says anyone must ever realize this, and perhaps consequentially stumble upon the true nature of the mind. One man imagined an adventure he might have. Then he imagined that he had had it. One man imagined an adventure he might have, and for a while imagined that he had had it. But the imagination didn't take real good and eventually slipped off, leaving the man still wanting the real adventure. "Now we're getting somewhere," said the ticket agent to the man once he stepped up to the right window. And please note, all of you genuine travelers, there is no right window. Hell is hardly a window extant at all. One man looked longingly into his eyes as he leaned himself back in a romantic dip, and while attempting to pick his pocket, cooed to himself, "Ooh, how much just to take me as far as you go?" And to many people this appears a reasonable approach, but I must tell you, as available it be and affordable it is, it ain't much of a trip. You could, if you really wanted to, adopt this attitude. If it's somewhere I can get to, why bother? A man appeared one day in the village and announced to all, "Tell me what your problem is and I will tell you its cure." And as soon as someone shouted out their particular problem, he replied, "That's an easy one. The actual problem is in you telling me that it is. So obviously the cure is not to tell me." Some of the villagers found him more useful than others. "Hey, dig it," said the dragon slayer. "I came here to slay dragons, and not merely the ones you think 'twould be useful to have dead. No, I tell you, nothing is more self-serving and unworthy of attention than sham death, along with all of its meaningless selectivity. The trailing of the mind after the endless arising and departure of all thoughts, accompanied by their constant assurances as to their pertinence." This particular dragon slayer is the one whose brother is a cobbler, who's already well known for having once said that if you're having foot problems, your problems are probably with your feet. Must be quite a family. To protect his rule from any potential challengers, one king hung everyone in the kingdom. And everyone stayed hung, as long as they'd look up and keep their eyes on the rope from which they hung. It's not difficult to want to be free, but it is impossible when it's you that's got you. Of course, this is a misstatement of the situation, since it is not you who has you, but rather your belief that it could be you who does. There's no question but that the locomotive appears to pull the train. But from what date did they begin pulling themselves out of hats? A and Z fell into a heated debate, and halfway to nowhere found this hilarious. One man went on a mental diet, deleting any thoughts of others from his neural bill of fare. He says if this gives the rewards he expects, he plans to expand the program to include thoughts about himself. Men came up with the idea of funny mirrors for carnivals from observing the normal reflections in their own minds. One self-absorbed, self-assumed, under-mystical achiever began to suspect that his lack of sufficient progress toward the goal was due to the fact that the goal was everywhere, and not just wherever he, at any given moment, believed it to be. P.S. upon S. This is one of those discoveries that gets rediscovered constantly by those undergoing the discovery process. And for all of you travel allegorists, you never feel you're sufficiently out of Paris as long as Istanbul is believed to be far away in some direction, until you realize that Istanbul is all around you, everywhere. See, that's one of the primary uses of mystical systems. Studying them gives you something to do while you're not doing anything. The first fruition of the human intellect occurs when a learned, curious, reflective, and analytical man stands before his library of books, illustrative of all mortal knowledge, and is struck by the simple fact that it's all made up. Which is why a certain ridiculous aroma seems to accompany all areas of serious academic and artistic criticism. And the more serious it is, the more ridiculous. And, speaking of such matters, I was hoping you wouldn't bring it up, but I'm sure you will. It's one thing to go off in search of mystical cities, fighting imaginary dragons along the way, but a step higher up the idiocy ladder to find fault with others likewise involved, but who pursue a course unlike your own. A long-time traveler tarried by a roadside as he pondered, have we possibly invented not only the destination of Istanbul, but also these feet here beneath us that we dream will carry us there? One thing you can count on is that the mind does not want to be shook and told to change buses in midstream. It doesn't want to be aroused at all, as a matter of fact, from its nap. A would-be mystic asked a bona fide virgin, is there such, if those such as me can't seem to get to that extraordinary place we wanted to go, is it good then to imagine that we have? To which the wise one replied, hey, why not? It works for everyone else concerning ordinary affairs. One of the nifty surprises awaiting a man somewhere along his private unplotted journey is that, with sufficient recognition of where it's actually headed, comes the incapacity to any longer be encouraged. A lad whined to his father, my tongue still hurts from drinking that too hot tea yesterday. And his old man responded, well, I didn't tell you to keep drinking it. Yeah, said the kid, but you didn't make me stop. And his father stood there, dumbfounded at the remark, and suddenly Life's voice broke in and said, now you know how I feel a lot of the time. There was once a train whose locomotive was assumed to know where it was going, and the first car after that simply and blindly followed it, as did the second car follow the first car, and the third, the fourth, and so on like that. And what, you may ask, is interesting enough about that to make it worth mentioning? Well, both nothing and something, all according to whether you really want to go somewhere or just around in circles, like everyone else. There are some things only a father can know, and never the children. There are certain ones who alone can be killed, and it is never the children. It is rather foolish to bemoan the inaccuracy of the weapon when aiming at the wrong target is the problem. Anytime you hear a voice passionately insisting that it knows what it's doing, you may be assured it is the mind. And, if you like, you may be equally assured that it is whistling in the dark. As always, running on the undisapprovable premise that self-established dogmatic bravado will cover all quantities of ignorance and uncertainty. The speaker addressed the crowd. All of the worthy awakened leave a record of their journey. And a voice asked, all? Okay, most, replied the speaker. And another voice asked, most? All right, some, he responded. Then yet another voice asked, some? And with that, the speaker paused in silence as he seemed to ponder the unfolding situation and the audience before him, and after a few moments resumed his comments. Perhaps you people would be more interested to know that all of the estimable enlightened use this fine electric juicer that we have available for sale today at a special price. And from the crowd finally came another voice that asked, how special? The clocking of what seems before us. There are only two urgencies, survival and thinking. And thinking runs on imaginary standard time. If you ride a train, please be advised in advance. You'll eventually realize, no matter how long it seemed otherwise, that inside all trains, it's dark. The sensation of illumination you've experienced has been ignorance in disguise. This relates further to the folly of trying to travel outside the home. Additional advisory. Those with the potential for future extraordinary Terpsichorean maneuvers might care to take note now of the need to abandon any distaste you may have for dancing with yourself, and that it is from such a position that all begin their mental adventure and struggle to leave the dance floor as presently laid. All in all, by gall, don't waste your energy kicking the wrong shins. The mind wants to talk about behavior because of who its parents are. By a pond was once a dam which wanted to become conscious and concluded that the way to do so was to move back further from the water. And of your rights. Earlier in the show, you read an item concerning a dam which wanted to become conscious and decided the way to do so was to move away from the water. And I want to know if you're still talking about the mind and thinking like you keep reminding us that you are. Sincerely, sort of, etc. There was once a world of curious creatures who believed that just because their planet was going somewhere, that they were. As Luella and Claude planned their great adventure of discovery, they took not into account the possibility of the adventure finding them. There was once a man who was blind and for many years suffered over his affliction, then discovered that he was not actually blind and then had to suffer over being stupid for so long. One man's motto is, why not wise up now while it's cheaper? One man began to wonder if the trick to handling thought might be to make something, anything, always precede thought. And upon further reflection, began to wonder if that something might be consciousness. The possibilities, he later said, do seem to be limited. But then sometime, even beyond that, he further mused. And yet all concepts of limitations of possibilities are a product of thought. So of what significance be they? And so, for the present, he returned to the picture of thought always preceded by consciousness. There was once a man who had a car that made disturbing noises. It ran all right, but made disturbing noises. The man tried to cure the noises, but couldn't. And the car continued to run okay. But still, the noises disturbed him. What to do? What to do? What to do? Perhaps the most cutting insult possible within a civilized setting. Civilized, learned, perhaps verging on sophisticated without the pejorative connotation, but truly within the front lines of civilization. The most cutting insult is probably to call a man shallow. Not having to do with a lack of depth of information, of thought, of what would be called education, but in the full sense of a man having a non-shallow repository of ideas, thoughts, notions, up with which he can come. So we're not talking about that, because the idea, by the way, of the noble savage and all of its permeations covers that in so much as within civilized milieus, someone without formal education can still be considered to be hip and sophisticated in a kind of natural, crude sense. In other words, they can lack the prevailing amount, the common prevailing amount of education, travel, experience in life, and yet not be considered shallow because they seem to have some sort of depth. This is no great importance, but if that wasn't clear enough, consider the continuing interviews that we'll do with sports figures who may be astoundingly physically able, but who obviously, it's no secret, but who obviously are not mental giants. But they are considered, without any analyzation, without any attack and no defense in either direction, but they are still tacitly assumed to have some sort of depth to them, which is part of what fame brings. Is once you have recognition that you're famous, you're just accepted as having some sort of depth. But back to which I was actually pointing, leaving aside those kinds of fringe, not exceptions, but those kind of fringe areas, amongst ordinary civilized people, and the more civilized, the more educated, the more learned, the more self-assumed hip with it, insightful, wise. Well, you guys know what hip in the full sense means, or what it used to mean. With it, amongst the more you are in that, the more we are in that sort of area, the more that we are speaking of people who are civilized, learned, experienced, world-traveled, reflective, analytical, all of the great comments, complimentary comments and descriptions you could make of civilized men. Amongst them, to call someone shallow then is perhaps the most cutting insult. What do they actually mean without understanding, without them thinking about it? What are they actually pointing to? It has nothing to do with any sort of internal intellectual quality. If you ask ordinary people what they mean, and if you begin with what I just said, that if you hinted that you didn't believe that had anything to do with any notation of quality or the lack thereof, that had nothing to do with quality, period, they would immediately insist that it was not true. That a person being shallow, if it did not have something to do with the quality of their, of course, they would want to say such things as soul, spirit, personality. The mind's all it amounts to. But let's say their personality, which is nothing but the mind as they look at it. They would insist that it does indeed reflect a quality. And by them saying that someone is shallow, it reflects or indicates, at least in their view, that the person lacks the necessary qualities to be considered a peer, a sophisticated, learned, hip peer, that they are simply shallow. But what are they actually saying? What do they mean when they say someone has depth? It's more common to use, as always, the more common area of verbal activity would be on the negative side. That is, you would hear more people, using various terms, accuse someone else of being shallow than you will pointing out of what great depth they have. In other words, it's always, the more common is the attack rather than any sort of affirmation of the other person's depth. But what are they saying when they accuse someone of being shallow? How can you appear not to be shallow? What does it take to appear to have depth under any conditions? It's simple. You can be you could be illiterate. You could be absolutely illiterate. You could be in the midst of the front ranks of the civilized, sophisticated, learned, and hip. And if you would refrain from saying almost anything, or if you would take so much time to respond to any question or comment directed toward you, to where the questionnaires and the people lost interest, which doesn't take long. If you would simply do that, you would never be accused of being shallow. I know it sounds almost funny, but I assume all of you already put it together, but you could literally have no idea what people are talking about. Suddenly you could have a man from the wilds of some Pacific or Atlantic island, illiterate, have no idea what's going on, and if in some way we dressed him up to where just on his appearance did not give him away, and there he was in the midst of the artistic crowd, the jet-set artistic, the recognized avant-garde of the intellectuals, of academia, just the cream of the intellectual and artistic crop at any time, and they're all in some big room. And you drop this man in the midst of them, and people he's in the midst of all the conversations and has no idea what they're talking about. None whatsoever about art, music, history, politics, science. It is all gibberish. But if he had been given instructions beforehand, and as I said, if nothing about his appearance gave him away, and people turned to him, if in fact they ever did, but let's assume, to make the point, which I think you already got, but assuming that such people, which are not, they're just, to a degree, I was going to say, worse about this than your ordinary or further back in life's parade. But as you know by now, people are not all that hungry to hear your ideas. And so the man could probably get by just by staying there if we just instructed that any time that eye contact is made with him, for him to nod and to do variations of this. But that would, if nobody ever said anything, the only danger is, the only reason I didn't do it that way, it would be, you might think would be harder later for us to talk about, well, that guy, but maybe a few people in the room. If somebody said, you remember that guy that had on, if you had something they could recognize, you remember the guy that didn't say much, who was over there that had on this kind of a blue pinstripe suit and he had that red tie, and they go, yeah. You go, did you get a chance to talk to him? And they go, well, yeah, he was over there. We wandered around. You know how things switch around, kind of little satellites of groups speaking. But yeah, he did end up, was over there. I remember I was with conductor so-and-so and doctor so-and-so, and he was standing there. I remember we were discussing, this and that. And you go, did you get a chance to engage him? Did he offer any ideas if you were talking about art? And they go, well, I'm not sure. Well, yeah, I guess he did, because I remember I was struck by how intelligent he was. That's the extreme, which is not unthinkable whatsoever. The other one would be simply this: if indeed, for some reason, somebody actually turned and directed a comment like, well, maybe two guys get to arguing over politics or some new symphony or some new art movement, some new novel, anything. And they get into serious discussion. Two experts, two professional critics, two observers, two participants in the field, and they blah, 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 and they banter back and forth, and finally they just turn, maybe it's just the three of them momentarily standing there, kind of an isolated little island there, and maybe one just turns to this guy and goes, well, hey, well, you heard what we're talking about. And he goes, yeah. He goes, well, what do you think? You heard it. What was your opinion? And he goes, That's about pushing it, but their conversation, you know how it would go. Then they would go back to talking, or they'd just wander off. The thing would fall apart. But then, within a few minutes, since they would remember it, just within a few minutes, if you walked over to either one of the people that had been in that little triumvirate of talking, our stooge, our guy, and these other two, and you asked, say, I saw you talking to that guy with the blue pinstripe and that red, yeah? We were just, nobody really knows him. It's his first time here. I saw you talking to him. Is he as sharp as I've heard he is? They would both go, yeah, I don't know who he is either, but he was surprising with his insight. I mean, he is obviously, he's one of us. What I'm trying to represent, this is not an attack on, as you know, on anything, but it's not an attack on art, sophistication, or anything. And I may have taken it too far afield for the, I can drag it back. You know what was represented that would make him qualify in people's minds as having depth? That is, he was not a shallow man, obviously. That's because when they asked him a question, he didn't immediately answer. Of course, in one of my examples, he never did answer. Well, neither one did he. But during one, they didn't even ask him, so he didn't have to answer. And the other one, they asked him a question, and he never answered. He took so long, they lost interest. Here's how it equates. It literally, from the mind's view, without ordinary people analyzing it, it is the temporal, in a sense. Well, I said literally. Take it either way. It is the temporal being mistaken for the spatial. That is, they ask the guy, what do you think? What do you think, looking back now, since de Kooning just died, what do you think, now that we've had a historical perspective, what do you think now of abstract expressionism? All right, the time involved. Nobody analyzes this way, certainly we know, but do you hear me? The time involved represents depth of comprehension, of intelligence, of knowledge. That it's like it takes time, because this man that they just asked, this man who is now going, Of course, I really pushed it by saying the guy was illiterate and didn't. It still works, but it would be a little bit better if he was literate. Or if he had an ear for imitation. That would work if we taught him, whatever it seems that people ask you a question, you can tell from their tone of voice, try to pick up the last few words they did so that if he could go, abstract expressionism. That would help a lot if he just repeat just part of the question. But do you hear, as strange, well, as simple or cartoonish as it may sound, it literally is, well, literal or figurative. I keep forgetting how good some of you are, that you realize it's the same thing. If it's not, it doesn't make any difference. That the temporal, that is the time that the guy goes, abstract expression. But we're debating, do you think there's a God or not? Is there a God? Is there a God? The longer it takes, you understand? It's like the longer that goes between the question and the guy ever responding, which to do it right, don't ever respond. Because they'll finally give up and just accept that you're a man of great depth. Probably more depth than they care to deal with, that you're never going to answer. Pushed a little to the extreme, by the way. I can't resist adding this wouldn't necessarily happen in life all the time, but you could, once they gave up, which they will pretty shortly, that they won't wait any longer. They'll lose interest. But if you ask some of the people involved, they might take that to be extreme, an extreme display or evidence of depth of intelligence that you never answered. Most of them wouldn't remember it that way. I don't know whether you're following me, but some people, if you went back and you asked them, say, that guy with the blue pinstripe and the red, I noticed a lot of people talking to him. Is he as sharp as I heard he was? One of them might go, sharp. I asked him about, looking back now, 30 plus years later, 40 years after the intro in the Western art world of abstract expressionism, what he thought now, looking back since it's kind of a reflective period in the art world. And of course, a bunch of us have been over there arguing, debating it, and we asked him, and rather than the man immediately express an opinion to support any of us or even a new opinion, he stood there. He stood there. He took his time. He did not jump in. He was not hasty. He stood there and he reflected for the longest time. But what I'm saying is, you might ask a few of them. There might be a few people that would even recognize once you ask them, they'd go, in fact, he never did answer me. And if you in some way, like, what does that prove to you? What does that, what do you think? They'd go, my God, I hadn't even thought about it. That man never did. Well, we didn't let him. We changed the conversation. I remember I walked off the bathroom and the other guy, Dr. So-and-so I was discussing with, he looked at his watch like, but that guy never did answer? Now that you mention it, when we walked off, he was still sitting there going, abstract expressionism. He was still. That would be kind of an extreme. It represents a depth. I repeat again, do notice this. No one takes this into account. I can't imagine even accidentally that the 10,000 monkeys with typewriters, after they got through writing all of Dickinson's work, accidentally, I can't believe that they would even accidentally ever come up with this. It's just never noted. But people are aware of it. And on the contrary, they are aware under certain conditions. It would normally have to be that the response of one being questioned would be in conflict with the questionnaires' attitude. But if it's too quick, it is seen as shallowness. But as I said, that is to be seen directly. It almost is. Under all conditions, that would be foreseeable. I can describe the response to the one being questioned. His response would have to be negative. That is, that if we did not have a time period, if somebody did not reflect, and two people are discussing whether abstract expressionism is real good art or not, and the guy, the pro, says, what do you think? And the guy goes, it sucks. Then his attitude, if you ask him later, like, well, boy, give it a lot of thought. His attitude would be, well, you're too hasty. And if you ask him later, what do you think about that guy's intelligence? You say, talk about an artistic dilettante. We were discussing, Dr. So-and-so and I, a small debate over the importance, the historical significance of abstract expressionism, and we just happened was trying to let this man the conversation, and I turned to him, I said, what do you think? And he said, it sucks. Just like that. Just said, hey, it's terrible. What kind of rube did they bring in here? That man, you understand? But if it had been the anti-position, ask him, and the guy said, to me it's a fraud. Then the guy would turn to the other doctor and go, see, he agrees with me. But by and large, it represents a kind of shallowness. Consider a bit further. If we get outside the immediacy of a face-to-face conversation, did I remind everyone tonight, are we still flashing on the intro of this program that this is all about the mind. It's not about bunches of intellectuals and artistic people staying around in a big room somewhere talking. It's about your mind, or about the mind. To get away from, to go beyond that kind of picturization of a face-to-face conversation, confrontation would be this. When presented naked, as much as ordinary sophisticated people will denounce those of deviousness, it is generally denounced, at least in social, personal relations, a Machiavellian attitude and approach. It is still considered to be a man of depth. Do I have to? All right. Under any particular example I might make up from some outsider's position, from their subjective position, a man of a devious, plotting nature might be involved with devious plots that are contrary to the observer's best interest, and therefore he might denounce the man personally. But it's like the respect that spies show to one another. It's the respect that tyrants of all stripes show to one another. I'm talking about the real tyrants, and it can be in the secular or the sacred world. That is, all would-be alpha male wolves once they get into the human area, because then you're beyond just mere physical strength. They have, if you want to call it, I started to say a begrudging respect, but that's almost a cliche that may not have any meaning in this area. They have a respect for one another. It's not hidden from ordinary view. There are all sorts of little snippets of conversation, stories that are oftentimes or sometimes considered apocryphal between rival kings, between madmen in history, between warriors that have been fighting and just for years and years, and their kingdoms or their tribes are attempting to slay each other and kill each other. And then there'll be some little mention in history or some little footnote that once one of them, somebody asked one of them, well, what do you think of so-and-so? And you would expect that the guy would go into a rage, and he says something like, when he thinks somebody's listening, he says something like, I'd like to play poker with him sometime. So, he's the only person on this planet I respect. I'd like to meet him. Whereas they have been absolute blood to the death enemies by all outside observation, by their behavior. Ordinary men, well, so that you don't think it's into exotic levels, why do people read gossip? It is the most common, it is the most popular form of all mental entertainment, always has been. And by gossip, that is not simply the supermarket, those little colorful newspapers that come out. It is not simply the tabloids. It's the Bible, it's the Quran, it's all of history. Well, it's all of history that's popular. It is simply gossip. That's what it is. Humans never gossip about shallow people. Or put it to you another way. This is a better intro to it. Scratch that. What is gossip? Gossip appears to be, forget the reality of it, forget all these things of people accusing the tabloids of making it up. Nobody cares. It's only rival tabloids. That is, it's rival, I think they call themselves serious journalists. It's only they who are upset and holler, how can people read that trash? They make up half of that. As if the readers care. As if the readers care. As if anybody cares unless they have a vested interest to the contrary, which is what serious journalists have. Why do people enjoy gossip? Now, I presented this once or twice before under different conditions. I still think that even on your own, some people intellectually should find that of interest. As always, there is a simplicity to it that evades the ordinary view, the ordinary mind. Ordinary people, I'm sure there have been a slew of psychological and sociological papers written on this. Without a doubt, there's probably more than a handful of doctorals have been written on that very thing. Speculating. Thousands of pages, or hundreds of pages, of speculations, statistics, interviews, why people read gossip, why people enjoy gossip. Gossip represents depth. It represents depth. The only people that gossip are written about, and again, forget whether it's true or not. If somebody just makes it up about a current movie star or politician, if somebody just sits at a tabloid office and just takes one bare thread of some sort of assumed fact and they just make it up. Notice what's made up. It is always complex. It always has a certain Byzantine flavor to it. Shallow, simplistic people are never the target of gossip. Of course, if they're already some way famous, if their name is suddenly in the headline and it's a slow day at the tabloid, they will simply, as often accused, they'll make up stuff the same as history does. They've got to fill up some of the pages, so they'll take somebody that, as far as anybody can tell, is shallow. They did one thing to get in the paper. They walked out in the middle of the street in downtown somewhere, pulled out a newsie, and turned around in a circle, and ended up killing 15 people before they shot him. That was this afternoon. Suddenly the papers, the reporters are all over the police to get his name and address, and they rush out to his neighborhood, they look up his family, and they find out the man has no story whatsoever. He graduated from high school, went straight to work at Kmart. He's been there ever since. Nobody, they remember he works in the stockroom. He has no girlfriend. He lives at home. His mother says she more or less forgot about him since he's been about 8, but she knows he lives in the back room. But it's a slow day. So the guy is so shallow, it's not worth, it'll catch people's attention, the headline, mad killer or mad gunman slays 15 people. Now that's a good headline. But if that's all there is, if that's all it is, and they go, oh, why did he do it? His mother goes, they go to Kmart. Why did he do it? Does anybody know? I barely remember him. They get a police psychiatrist to study his profile in depth, which takes a guy 5 minutes. He reads it over and over. He says, is this it? And they go, yeah. They go, why did he do it? And they go, I don't know. So you got no story. They have to make up a depth. Of course, the obvious one here would be that the man was so lacking in a richness. I just realized there's a story there. His life thus far was devoid, so devoid of any variety, richness, cultural, social nourishment that he snapped. He snapped from shallowness. Back to where I was trying to point out, I assume you can pull your attention and your imagination away when I use terms like Machiavellian. I'm not and tyrants and rulers and warriors in everyday life. There is read into other people, or it's assumed. If you have interest in other people, there's an assumption, well, it can be real, but there's an assumption of a complexity for someone to just appear to be intelligent. It doesn't have to be in any sort of threatening manner, but if a person comes out to give a lecture, if there's a teacher somewhere, a commentator, what do they do among all things? They go through, to varying degrees, how they can pull it off, but they appear, whether if you catch them and you think they're being theatrical and pretentious or not. But one way or the other, if they're going to be considered to be intelligent, there is this continual appearance of reflection, of a guy thinking, checking his notes. Maybe checking his notes and looking off as though, have I changed my mind, or is there more I can say? There has to be this appearance that there is depth going on, that there is complexity, that the man's mouth does not open and what just immediately ran through his brain come out by any ordinary description. If you gave that to any ordinary intelligent person and you said, would such a man do you think in any way qualify as being intelligent, much less wise or insightful? That if you looked at him and your impression was that whatever was happening right then in his mind was coming out of his mouth just as fast as he could talk, if he never showed any signs of reflection, musing, ruminating, I guess people would finally understand it's a simple question, but no one ever thinks about it. No one literally. But if it was lacking, people would notice something. If you had a famous person, let's say he had books out in some area, that he became an expert in history or mythology or sociology or something, and he became popular, people wanted to hear him, and you went to see him, and he apparently was giving no thought to what he did. People would find, they would be uneasy. His popularity would be short-lived. Does anybody hear it? That if it apparently, that just everything that you heard, no matter that it started out and it sounded like you'd read his books and you found them enjoyable, you wanted to hear it, and he started out saying just like his books, and oh boy, this will be great. And there for the period of the lecture, you had a feeling that was just going, bleh. I don't mean just mechanical that he had memorized. I don't mean that. There just seemed to be no sign that there was any thought going on at the time. People would have no idea how to analyze this. But after a reasonable length of time, an hour or so, an ordinary crowd would be restive. And when they left, if you were outside and you went, what did you think of him? He would not be the recipient of widespread approval. It doesn't matter exactly what they'd say, and I just have to start making up. I could get close, but they simply would think, well, I don't know, he's not what I expected. I don't know. Well, would you go see him again? Would you go pay a few bucks or go see him? Well, no, maybe, I don't know. It is simply this. Using ordinary terminology and ordinary view, for a person to appear, for a person to be taken by others to be intelligent, sophisticated, but intelligent in the full sense, we don't have to keep coming up with synonyms, to be truly intelligent, verging on insightful or wise. It is, without any analyzation, assumed by others that such a person is of great intellectual complexity. It's almost a self-obvious statement, if you followed. If I said that to ordinary people, they would go, well, assuming they understood, if I didn't muck it up too much, they'd go, so? Because all it sounds like is you're saying an intelligent person, or that ordinary people assume or will take another person as being intelligent only if he appears to be thoughtful. Or I'll make it even cruder, that ordinary people, all you're saying is ordinary people will assume or will accept another person as being thoughtful only if they appear to be thoughtful. Yeah. And they go, what's the point? You're nuts. You're just saying A is A. A is A if it appears to be A, or A is only A if it acts like A. What are you saying? And as always, there's nothing to prove to ordinary people. Well, you guys, you should know by now what your mind thinks, to say that that's of any way of any value, and that if you do know anything, it's due to the fact that you will stop, or that you do stop, especially often private, that you'll continue reflecting, thinking on things, figuring them out, working them out in your mind. And that even when asked, perhaps you hesitate, as any good thoughtful man would, and you hearken back to what you've thought on this subject before, worked out, or perhaps you even feel as though, I've never heard the question put with exactly that twist. So then you have to hearken back to related areas. What's the closest area? What's the closest question over which I have pondered and toiled my hot little neural hands in the past? How is this connected? How might I connect this to things about which I've already given deep ponderings? Well, anyone who knows anything about the human mind, about their own mind, knows that that is just fairy tales. That's cartoons. It's imagination. It has no bearing whatsoever on reality. That there is no such thing in the mind going on as what I just described. Not of any value, not of any pertinence, not of any meaning. And you either know that or you don't, which hardly anybody on the planet ever knows that. No reason to know it. Doesn't do them any good. But then consider how, then I will assume that there are enough of you that even have experience past that point, that not only, as I opened up by saying, it is perhaps the most cutting insult that's possible to deliver to another sophisticated, learned, intelligent human being, that is to call them shallow. That is the very definition of someone who knows the nature of the mind and is capable of operating consciously somewhere beyond that. Shallow would be their best description. Shallow is what they're looking for once they understand it. Boy, I wish I could be more shallow. I wish there was not this periodic lag time between my reactions, not just physically, but my living of life, and my mind wanting to go, ooh. Because, again, I'm talking on the basis that some of you hearing are to this point of understanding that you know, even though you may not be able to do it right this second, but you know the, ooh, let me think about this. Could not be a more meaningless act. It represents nothing. Ooh, well, wait a minute. Wait a minute. There's nothing to think about. The only thing there is to think about is thinking. Which might be all right, if in fact you did not already know that thinking doesn't amount to anything. But see, since ordinary people do not know that, if you tried to condemn, make them realize that it was condemnable to say, hey, you're wasting your time thinking. And they go, well, why do you say that? And you go, well, now listen to me. The only thing you think about is thinking, which is not true, but they'd go, so? Well, the reason I say it's not true is because in the past I've said that the ordinary mind will never reflect on itself. And so I didn't want this I knew sounded contradictory, but since most of you, well, I'll assume again that most of you or some of you are beyond the limits of thinking, so what? It sounds contradictory. Just wanted to see if anybody was awake. It sounds contradictory, maybe. But here's the only thing I can say about that, is that maybe it does. Yeah, I can say that. I can say that. There is, how about this? There is something beyond ordinary analyzation throughout the so-called history, but the mythology, which we could say is the intellectual history of man, of a great intrigue, of some sort of instantaneous transformation, all the way from from Zoroaster, suddenly looking up at the sun and realizing, coming up with this concept of what it means that the mind always believes that there is a distinct division between this and that, between light and dark, that he underwent an instant enlightenment. Or from the Buddha sitting under a tree after all these years and all this time, that suddenly he heard the sound of a certain bird, with the sound of a certain fruit dropping, and he realized it. Or of Muhammad being told to read, and he says, I can't read. And I said, read. And he suddenly went, wow. And he saw what they meant. Or a Moses. And suddenly a bush says, don't look over here. You know, what? Or all the figures of the Christ. The whole thing of a sudden transformation. And of course more modern up to date is Captain Marvel, being able the kid to holler Shazam and boom! By God, he was Captain Marvel. There is a real intrigue and it is deep within the neural system of man, of the idea. And it is at the heart of all religions also, and it's at the heart of all their attraction, is the idea that there can be, should be, but at least that there can be an instant transformation of some kind, from a non-believer to a believer, or from a heathen for someone in the dark, out in the cold, cut off from a close connection to the powers of creation, and that by doing some act, or by some grace of God, by something, it is an instantaneous transformation. That it's not a matter that in some way you petition the gods and you pray to them, you know, get me out of this, change me, give me new understanding, do something. And the gods go, well, you go, come on, I've been praying for years and years. And they go, well, Notice, they're not even any, there's no kind of religions like that. I'm surprised heathens hadn't come up, atheists. That would be, in fact, that's the worst. That's kind of taking what I said, the shallowness. That would probably be the worst insult you could hurl toward gods, is that they're hesitant. Well, see, that sounds like the opposite of, well, the worst insult is shallowness. It just sounds like they're contradictory. You told me you were better than that. It is instantaneous. That is the only thing. That represents the ultimate. Anything less than that, it's not right. It doesn't strike anybody as being right. Everything that's of any value to the human mind must be instantaneous. And the more the value it is, and it does not have to be just something that seems fairly metaphysical. If someone's going to win the lottery, they want the number read, and you won the $20 million now. They want the number read. They don't want to start if it's 10 numbers, and they read 7. And then it takes them 6 months, and 7 of them you got. And then it takes them another 6 months, they start, and the next number 8 is, you don't want that, or on the contrary, even if they read your number, and you went, whee, I won $20 million. Now it says always, or is our new policy, this $20 million will not be awarded until further notice, and that means we're thinking about it. Oh, you'll get it, but we're going to think about it, and don't call us. It has to be instantaneous. The more it seems of value all the way from that to some sort of spiritual, psychological transformation, there's simply no such thing as a gradualness. It's not even conceivable. That would be the ultimate, in that case, of shallowness. They would want an instant response. And yet when you're talking about the ordinary mind looking at other ordinary minds, it is the epitome of shallowness and that which is of no interest and of no value. Now, of course, the question is, if you want to question it, is why? Why to the mind does hesitation, Machiavellian plotting, intrigue, less than forthrightfulness, less than immediate sincerity, upfrontness, openness, is why it takes a lack of all of these things for a person to be considered by other minds. Forget people, but by other minds, or for your mind to look at parts of its mind, if that is not the case, if it does not lack those things. Or contrary, if it's too open, direct, and straightforward, no, I'm on the wrong track, says the mind. No, things are not that simple, sir, says one part of your mind to another part of your mind. No. That is far too simplistic to be a true answer. What you've stumbled upon may be a piece of something, but that's certainly not the answer because, no, that's too obvious. What we should do is go curl up perhaps with a good book and think about this. We definitely need to think about it in much greater depth.